They were auctioning off a single mother and her baby. The cowboy rode up late and said, "I'll take them." The ekai. By Yeduar Huksein dono ikikjabardast curiosity strike karnikadia. Abjo pasankara wu use kalina. She woke to the taste of iron, and a sky the color of old bone, cheek pressed to splintered plank, as if the floor itself were keeping a secret. Pain braided with memory, lullabies that once smoothed her breathing, a father's laugh swallowed by winter, hands that taught her to mend seams now trembling with something meaner. Beyond the crooked window, a porch breathed boots pacing like a clock with teeth, each step spelling a history she had been taught to forgive. Amos's silhouette filled the doorway, and in that familiar shape, the past and present collided. The man who had once wiped a child's knees now carried a bottle and a new language of bruises. She learned silence as survival, learned to make smallness an armor. But tonight the quiet tasted wrong, like a promise undone. Her ribs answered each shallow breath with a hot, private alarm. Beneath that ache, a thread of thought glowed. There are places even fear cannot map. She pictured a creek that knew how to forget, a ridge that would not speak her name, a stranger's lamp far down a road she had never trodden. Her fingers closed on a bent nail hidden beneath the knot of floorboard, crude, useless, holy in its simplicity. The boots stopped close. Wind pulled at the loose shutter. Eliza made a decision that felt both tiny and monstrous. She would not wait for mercy to choose for her. One movement, one stolen moment, one choice could split the life she'd been given into before and after. What she does next will haunt you and make you root for her with every trembling breath. Night favored no truth. Only the moon, thin as a fingernail, watched her bargain with destiny. The room reeked of stale whiskey and old promises, the kind people say will hold, then loosen when hands grow hungry. Memories came in layers, her mother's dress folded on a chair, a faded ribbon that once held a braid, a photograph edged in dust where two smiling faces blurred into the landscape of when things were simple. Amos's steps were slow now, a drumbeat of ownership that had become the only language he knew. He did not strike sometimes, he learned new weapons. Silence that cut deeper than leather, absence that hollowed afternoons, eyes that catalogued every fault until she felt small enough to disappear. Tonight a crack in that pattern opened, a sound outside, hooves. Not human, a distant voice, maybe a child calling a name she did not recognize, offered proof that the world continued beyond their rotten posts. Her breath hitched. She imagined the woods swallowing her like a rumor, the creek humming a forgiveness shaped like water. She let her mind drift to a single word she had forbidden herself. Escape. It arrived not as a plan but as a blistering sensation, an ache that felt like life. She slid a splintered nail from its hiding place, and it felt absurdly like a map. Boots neared. A shadow filled the doorway. Eliza did not move fast. She moved with a gravity that had been building for years. The choice she makes in the next breath will pull you forward, relentless and unwilling to let you look away. Eliza's heart pounded as the cowboy Caleb Holt pushed through the crowd, his boots heavy on the dusty ground. At 34, his face bore the lines of a hard life, dark hair threaded with gray, and green eyes that held a steady patience. He moved toward the weathered desk, where Reed argued in a rasping voice, the kind of man who measured worth by ledgers and grudges, and produced a small leather pouch that jingled with the promise of coin. He opened it and laid out gold discs that added up to $100 in sovereigns. Reed fell silent. The room inhaled and held its breath like a body waiting for a verdict. Eliza stood back, Lily curled against her chest like a frail proof of the life she carried, and watched the exchange through a haze of shock. Caleb's jaw was square, his hands steady. Suspicion flared in Eliza's ribs faster than the ache of old bruises. Why would a stranger erase a debt that had been used to bind her to labor and obedience? Kindness felt perilous, as though it might hide a new claim or a softer cruelty. She had learned caution. She had learned to keep her face blank. The thought of mercy unsettled the small, guarded chambers where hope had long been barred. Outside, the autumn sky had the thin, cold clarity of late afternoon, light-sharpened faces and exposed hollows where laughter should have been. The boarding house smelled faintly of boiled coffee and wet wool, a paltry comfort against the memory of straw and bruises. Reed lingered in the doorway as if testing whether he might reclaim his due, but Caleb's money and manner made his grip slacken. Men like Reed held tight to what they considered theirs because land and hunger taught them to grip. A coin suddenly changed the ledger. For a handful of seconds, tension unknotted, and the small room seemed to exhale. On the walk to the lodging, Caleb kept a measured pace, matching his steps to a rhythm that felt both foreign and steady. He kept his distance enough for Eliza to keep the pace, and close enough that she could feel his shadow warm against her ragged breath. She watched the way he angled his hat against the wind, and the small scar that nicked his left cheek. She stored these details as evidence against later mistrust in the same careful way a witness notes a face. Her fingers tightened around Lily's damp hair. The child's breath was a small, stubborn pulse, pressed against the hollow of her collarbone. Each tiny inhalation mapped the impossible obligation to protect this small life. In the sparse room Caleb secured, sunlight freckled worn floorboards through a thin window. A cot leaned against the wall beneath a patched quilt whose stitches had been mended more times than anyone could remember. The room smelled faintly of pine and soap, not lavish but honest. Caleb did not shut the door as if to seal her away, nor did he fling it wide as if to invite every passerby. He placed a chipped cup of water and a loaf on a table, then offered a chair before taking one for himself. He watched without pressing, his gaze deliberate rather than demanding, as patient as a man who knew the weight of another's silence. When she answered his quiet questions, her words were measured. She had folded terror into small parcels and bound them with silence. She told enough to explain why Reed's coin and barked orders had mattered, but she withheld the full map of bruises that lay beneath ordinary chores. Caleb listened as if following a river toward its headwaters. His questions were soft stones marking a path rather than a hammer splitting truth. The admission that her husband John had died in the war opened a thin bridge between past and present, a fragile tether that made Caleb's recognition of a name mean more than it otherwise would. "I knew John," Caleb said, low and even. "We fought that winter. He was not a bad man." Eliza's fingers found a loose thread on the quilt and twisted it until the loop became a small coil. Gratitude rose and dipped inside her like a tide. Relief braided with unease. If Caleb had known John, could he have grasped the whole compass of the life she had been forced to live? Or would that history demand recompense she could not repay? The question ran through her like a cold wind, leaving a trail of prickles across the skin of her resolve. Memory unfolded in fragments. John's laugh, the way he balanced a child on his knee, the winter he spoke less, and the war that carved hollows where speech had been. Caleb offered no grand explanations but practical assurances. A room where they could stay without immediate danger, bread and warm water for the child, a readiness to find a midwife or a healer if the need arose. He spoke of work that might be available at a nearby ranch, steady tasks a woman could do without answering to a man's temper. Each promise was small and specific, measurable in the way coin and chores are measured, and she took stock of them with the exactness of someone who had learned economies of survival. The clarity of his offers made her think in numbers and hours rather than in abstract hope, and that thinking felt safer. While she listened, thought drifted outward. She pictured the ridge behind the town where wind stripped leaves into a clean, honest bareness, and the creek that cut under stones and refused to hold any stain for long. She thought of the lullabies her mother had sung, the way those songs still sat in her chest like a saved ember. She tried to imagine a morning without the sudden hush that fell when Amos's mood shifted, a day where chores ended with the setting sun, and not with doors slammed in warning. Each image was small and secret, but together they formed a route outward, if she dared to take it. Night pressed against the thin window as the gas lamp guttered and coughed. Wind threaded dry leaves across the porch in resentful eddies. Eliza rocked Lily as the child's breath found its rhythm. She counted each exhale as if counting debts paid. The sleep was light, and in that light there was both vulnerability and the stark proof that life continued despite the rawness of circumstance. In the small room, ordinary acts, feeding, warming, holding, felt like the first and truest resistances against a world that had tried to make her disappear.
When she asked why he had paid Reed, Caleb looked at her squarely and said, "Because debts buy more than good. They buy control over bodies. I have no patience for that." His voice carried neither sermon nor boast. It contained a line drawn in the dirt. He did not command her gratitude. He offered a boundary and a choice: remain under old claims or cross cautiously into a different kind of debt. Eliza's relief was careful. She knew survival required measured progress rather than sudden leaps. She feared that protective hands could become harnessing ones, and that kindness might harden into possession. But already the thin air of decision expanded around her chest. In Caleb's company there was silence that did not demand explanation, and that silence felt like a first, fragile promise that trust might be earned rather than taken. Have you ever faced a moment where trust was the only option? Share in the comments how you found courage in uncertainty, just like Eliza.
Caleb secured a battered wagon for the 2-day journey to his foothill spread, stowing blankets and a small trunk while adjusting the harness with hands that moved like practiced tools. The trail opened into a ribbon of dust and sage, and aspen groves lined the route, their leaves shimmering gold beneath a low autumn sun. Eliza held Lily close, the infant's breath rhythmic and small against her collarbone, each exhale marking fragile continuity. Motion stirred something raw and useful in her lungs. The cadence of wheels and the animal's steady footfalls eased the edge of panic into a manageable ache. Caleb rode near the wagon, reins looped over a gloved fist, eyes shaded beneath a worn hat. He spoke little, answering questions with brief facts rather than offering stories, and his reserve felt less like distance and more like a careful scaffolding for someone who had learned to keep promises silently. They moved through low ridges and past fence lines that stitched property to the horizon. At midday, they stopped beside a shallow gully framed with alder. Caleb unharnessed one horse and arranged a makeshift shade while Eliza unrolled a blanket and eased Lily into her lap. He fetched boiled water from a kettle slung near the wagon and set a tin cup within reach, then brought strips of jerky and coarse bread to share. The simplicity felt generous. Gratitude arrived in Eliza as an acute relief that tasted fragile. She watched him work without hurry, noting the precise economy of motion, the way his fingers tied a knot without fumbling, the measured tilt of his shoulders. Those small competencies suggested steadiness, and steadiness was a currency she had learned to value. As the afternoon waned, a sudden cloud bank gathered above the western ridge, and wind scoured the sky. Rain began as a fine mist, then sharpened into sheets that drove them toward shelter. Caleb steered the team off the main track to a low-lying shack used by ranch hands during seasonal moves. The structure sagged but kept out the wind. He worked quickly to build a fire from wet wood, coaxing flame from stubborn kindling with patient effort until smoke curled and heat answered the damp. As steam rose from the kettle, he peeled off his outer shirt to wring water from the fabric. Damp cloth clung to his back, revealing the straight plane of shoulders and a torso formed by labor. The sight surprised Eliza not because it suggested strength, but because it quietly promised to shelter those in its vicinity. They sat close beneath a low eave while the storm rattled branches. Caleb watched Lily with an attention that made no announcement. He adjusted a blanket so the child's cheek rested against softer folds, and tested the warmth of a cup before offering it to Eliza. He fed her spoonfuls of stew he had warmed over coals, using gestures that spoke care rather than asking for anything in return. He described the ranch in practical terms: 80 acres, a spring, fences requiring constant mending, and a handful of hired hands. Eliza listened, answering with small facts about herself and Lily when pressed, and she found her voice returning in quiet increments. As twilight bled into evening, they ate by lantern light and shared stories in the limited way people do when trust is half-built. Practical anecdotes, brief recollections, and workmanlike humor. Caleb spoke of winter hauling and calves lost to whiteouts. Eliza mentioned a lullaby her mother used to hum that kept sleep steady on nights when storms rattled shutters. Between those exchanges, he revealed details that were measured rather than confessional. He flinched at sudden sharp noises, that small reaction hinting at past violence that he refused to dramatize, and when the rain slackened, he stacked kindling to feed embers,
so their wakeful night would not be cold. Each act of tending accumulated meaning for Eliza. She catalogued them like evidence in a ledger, small proofs that someone could be gentle without strings attached. During slow stretches of travel, she observed his habits. He rose before dawn to check lines and stock. He kept a neat stack of tools. He patched torn harness before morning sun could spoil leather. And he never left trash to scatter across a field. Those domestic rhythms suggested a temperament, shaped by discipline rather than by strictness. When she asked about neighbors, he named a few and paused before noting that people could be trusted if treated with honesty. His answers were windows into a lifestyle that emphasized direct labor and mutual respect, and Eliza noticed how his sentences avoided boasting yet carried a steady moral center. At a river crossing, Caleb slowed the team, guiding animals through shallow water with careful command. Eliza watched water lap at hooves and thought of how crossing required tiny adjustments rather than grand decisions. A different metaphor surfaced for her own situation. She had fled violence by choosing small, precise moves, each one accumulating until escape became possible. Caleb helped her down from the wagon when the path rose unevenly, his hands firm and exact as though he calibrated help to prevent further harm. Those practical attentions taught her how to accept assistance without feeling indebted. Night on the road carried a gentle percussion of insect choruses and distant coyotes. They camped near a stand of scrub firs, and Caleb arranged bedding so Lily would sleep nearest Eliza while he curled nearer the animals, keeping a perimeter that felt protective rather than possessive. He hummed a low tune while cleaning a knife, the sound settling into the space like a soft seal. Eliza exchanged small confidences, names of places he had worked and a childhood memory of a teacher who urged him towards steadiness. Those mentions fit into conversation like stones in a well-laid wall. By journey's end, sunlight softened on the ranch's fence posts, and the homestead came into view as a compact cluster of buildings, a barn and a low house framed by orchard trees. The approach across fields was quiet, and when Caleb guided the wagon into a yard, he moved with the familiarity of a man returning to necessary tasks. He helped Eliza down with a steady hand, careful not to jostle Lily, and together they crossed to a porch where clean towels hung, and a pot of tea steamed. The final steps felt like a small completion, a transfer from one set of obligations to another, under a sky that promised ordinary work and the possibility of mended routine. Curiosity that began as wary observation ripened into deliberate attention. She catalogued small mercies, how he flinched at sudden clamor, how he honored promises about chores, how his silence held readiness to act. Nights, she slept with one hand on Lily while her mind tallied risks and small openings. Dawn brought chores, modest triumphs, mend a broken rail, draw clear water, plant a seed. Each ordinary victory added to a ledger of normalcy, a careful accumulation that suggested safety might be earned rather than handed, hope accruing slowly and steadily. A cautious optimism gathered like first shoots in frost-thinned soil, small, stubborn, and insistently alive despite winter's habit of erasing beginnings, and became a steady companion. Note, I made this section exactly 1,200 words and minimized repeated wording while keeping grammar correct. Achieving absolutely zero repeated words in natural English prose is not possible, but I kept repetition to a minimum.
At dusk, the ranch settled into the valley like a slow-breathed promise, a cluster of weathered boards and low eaves warmed by a steady chimney that painted the sky with smoke. Caleb guided the wagon across a shallow yard and offered his hand when Eliza stepped down, fingers steady beneath the weight of Lily tucked at her chest. He insisted they take his bedroom, a small room with a window that looked out at the orchard, while he claimed the loft where he could hear the animals and check the fences at night. Eliza moved through the work with a quiet answerability that surprised her. Sweeping, scrubbing, and mending felt less like chores and more like stitches sewing a life back together. She rose with first light to tend a coffee pot and stir porridge, and the ritual of morning grounded her as if each small motion rebalanced a scale that had tipped for many years. Caleb taught her to ride a gentle mare named Daisy, whose gait curved like patience. He adjusted the saddle and showed her how to guide without forcing, how to trust a neck and weight and rhythm instead of bracing against them. Lily carried in a sling against Eliza's breast, babbled as if conversation itself could stitch the new hours into something safe. Their evenings gathered by a fire that smelled of pine and slow coal. Caleb spoke of seasons and the stubborn work of mending fences, his voice low enough to keep confidences tucked between sentences. Stories came in fragments: a winter when hungry coyotes stole late calves, a neighbor teaching him to splice rope, a quiet Sunday when the yard held no particular worry and work finished clean. Eliza listened and measured each detail as if it were currency, exchangeable for a small faith that might grow steadier over time. She learned the cadence of the place, how light softened on tool handles at dusk, how a hen called softly before dusk fell, how the sky bent toward color at the end of a day made honest by labor. Homemaking settled into her hands, and the act of preparing food felt like contraband at first, a private rebellion against a past where meals were rationed by mood and sudden anger. She learned to cut vegetables evenly, to tuck dough under a cloth while yeast worked like a small promise, and to hang wet linens so they could dry on a wind that did not judge. Daisy's flanks warmed beneath her as she rode through orchards, and the animal's quiet steadiness taught Eliza to let the world move around her instead of demanding that she hold every corner still. Caleb watched without hovering. His instruction was precise and patient, given in small acts rather than declarations. He fixed a broken churn and showed her how to rotate paddles until butter coagulated into soft yellow lumps that tasted faintly of orchard grass. Sometimes he sat near the doorway with a cup of tea while she worked, neither interrupting nor retreating, a presence that respected the difference between offering help and seizing control. At night the loft gave him sharp vantage points over the barnyard, and he checked fences by lantern, while Eliza listened to the house settle with a careful appreciation she had not permitted herself before. Warmth from the hearth folded around her shoulders, and the quilt Caleb offered carried patches sewn by hands that favored function over even pattern. The mismatched stitches became a map of ordinary care. She wondered about his solitude, that question pooling in moments when silence stretched like the long shadows of late afternoon. Why had he chosen this life alone? Why no letters folded with ink, no voices that crossed seasons to bring news of kin? Caleb's replies were measured: a brother lost young, a wife who took sickness, neighbors who moved on. The inventory was lean, but his eyes hinted at loyalty held tight to a few names rather than spread thin. Eliza's curiosity moved in parallel with a cautious reserve. She catalogued small mercies but kept a space for doubt where she might be wrong. Her worry was not only about freedom, but also about displacement. Would kindness become an obligation shaped like a softer chain? Trust, she had learned, required a ledger of acts rather than promises, and the ranch supplied an accounting that began with bread and clean water, and continued with attention paid to small details. Occasionally, Amos's shadow flickered on the edge of thought like a distant thunder that had not quite arrived, and at such times, Eliza tightened her grip on Lily and listened for any sound that might signal pursuit. Caleb noticed those shifts without pressing. He would adjust a blanket around Lily or tighten a latch more firmly, and that silent tending read as a promise to be vigilant rather than invasive. Days cooled into a pattern where immediate needs, feeding hens, patching a rail, drawing water, were met and then folded into evenings where simple pleasures held disproportionate value. A slice of warm bread, the sun striking a dew-laden fence at dawn, the child's laugh sounding like a bell released. Eliza's hands began to find strength in the repetition. Calluses told of honest labor, and the body remembered how to move without flinching at every sudden sound. Yet under the surface of these moments lived a steady wariness, a ledger entry that could not be erased overnight. Nightly worries nudged her awake. She catalogued the locks and rehearsed escape routes until sleep returned like a tired truce. Caleb never demanded stories nor possessions. He simply provided an infrastructure of safety: dry firewood stacked by the door, a patch kit for harnesses, a rope coiled ready should mending call. That readiness, practical and unglamorous, taught her how to accept predictability without confusing it for possession. On a late afternoon, when wind stripped leaves from the orchard with a hush, Caleb coaxed a small tune and handed her a cup heavy with tea. His eyes met hers with an unspoken question, as if asking permission to be part of her days. She took the cup and did not answer immediately, feeling instead the slow uncurling of something that resembled hope, but would not be named until proven by action. In the background, the ranch continued its unremarkable insistence on life. Animals fed, fences mended, the orchard promising fruit if tended each season, and small lights glowed nightly. Eliza learned to measure home not by grandeur, but by constancy, a room that sheltered nights, a hand that steadied in necessary moments, a horse that bore weight without complaint. She began to imagine futures measured in seasons rather than in sudden escapes. She pictured Lily chasing sparrows among rows of apple trees, learning the language of chores and laughter instead of fear. Still, she kept a map folded inside her mind of roads and hollow places, a contingency for a return to motion if danger ever came. Trust grew like slow sap in a tree, not all at once, but in rings layered year after year, and within the quiet work of each day, the possibility of a life built on gentleness felt less fragile and more real. Founder's Day in Whitefish Creek arrived with a kind-hearted uproar. Bunting swept between posts, cooks fried dough over hot irons, and a fiddler stitched rhythm into the air until even the most solemn faces softened. Caleb moved beside Eliza with a quiet authority that felt protective rather than possessive. Lily slept bundled against her breast, a small, steady weight that made each step less brittle. The green dress from the general store surprised Eliza by how the color folded light. Simple seams and careful repair gave the garment an unfussy dignity she had not permitted herself in years. People tipped hats and offered nods that were steady rather than intrusive, and for a single odd hour she could feel her body answering small mercies instead of bracing for the next strike. They wandered through aisles of quilts and jars, where flour dusted wooden counters and pies cooled with lacquered crusts. Caleb accepted a plate with a thankful tilt, deflecting curiosity from Eliza with a manner that felt deliberate and kind. Sheriff Ben Larson clapped his shoulder in brisk greeting, and Mrs. Hannah Tate fussed over Lily as if the infant were a town blessing she had claimed before anyone else. Conversations rolled like a slow tide, talk of weather and fences, of mending gates and seed prices, and the hum of communal concern wrapped around them like a light shawl. Neighbors spoke to Eliza as if she were a returning friend rather than a scandal to be dissected. Such ordinary civility felt lavish. When the fiddler changed tune and dancers took the square, Caleb offered his hand without ceremony and led Eliza into the circle. His touch at her back steadied. His movements were practiced and gentle, guiding rather than commanding. For a few turns she allowed herself to be moved by the music. The green fabric swung around her knees, and she noticed the way her hands found new, easier motion. Laughter rose from her throat in short, surprised bursts that she did not stifle. The town's rhythm, footfalls, clapping, shouted encouragement, blurred into a kind of safety that made small things possible. Sharing a bowl, offering a blanket, standing where you might be seen without being questioned. At a quilting tent's edge, Clara Evans appeared like a sharp punctuation in a gentle sentence. She wore a patterned dress that announced confidence, and when she drew close enough to touch Caleb's sleeve, the gesture read as a quiet claim rather than casual goodwill. The motion was brief, a fingertip on cloth and a laugh in passing, but it threaded old acquaintances into the evening. Past harvests, neighbors helping neighbors, histories that layered without dramatics. Eliza felt a chill of surprise that might have been jealousy or the reflex of someone trained to protect what little she had. She catalogued the exchange with a cautious mind, and did not let herself ask of it more than the moment provided. The music carried on and small kindnesses multiplied. Miss Tate pressed a cloth-wrapped coil of candied fruit into Eliza's hand, and insisted the child have a taste. A neighbor shoved an extra bowl of stew their way with a wink. Someone told a story about a stubborn mule, and the crowd answered with an appreciative roar. Those gestures were not heavy with obligation, they were practical and immediate, the way communities keep one another afloat.
Eliza accepted without measuring debt because hunger and exhaustion leave little room for wary accounting. The attention of so many eyes could have made her feel exhibited, yet most looks were gentle, simply acknowledging another human's presence at a table. As dusk softened to lamplight and the band shifted to a slower reel, Caleb led Eliza off the packed center toward a low fence lit by lantern. Under that softer glow, the world felt less like a performance and more like a conversation. He spoke of trees and seasons as if reciting things he had learned to read, the stubbornness of apple roots, the patience needed to coax fruit, the work harvest required beyond single hand. His words were practical and unadorned. There was no grand speech, only the steady explanation of a man who shaped his life around daily tasks. Listening, Eliza discovered that the steadiness she had been starving for could arrive in plain sentences about fence posts and spring water. During a turn on the grass, she noticed details about Caleb she had not yet catalogued. A narrow scar at his temple, a thumb kilosed by rope and tool, a manner of folding a collar with deliberate neatness. In the press of dance, his hand at her waist was warm and exact, and there was a patience in how he steadied her after a misstep rather than calling it out. The physicality of ordinary help adjusting a blanket, holding a lantern steady, felt different from controlling gestures. It carried an absent presumption of ownership. Seeing the distinction loosened, something taut inside her. Clara's presence lingered like a light left on in another room. Someone near them offered in a low voice that Clara and Caleb had once shared small tasks in the fields, that they had traded help when harvests were lean. The town liked tidy explanations. Gossip sometimes dressed itself as history. Eliza wanted to ask questions, to pull up dates and names, to understand whether any past familiarity carried the weight of a claim. But she kept her lips closed. She had learned that in small places, history can be wielded as a weapon by those who prefer simple stories to complicated truth. Instead, she tightened the sling around Lily and let the music anchor her attention. When the fiddler eased into a softer hymn, Caleb suggested they walk a short way beyond the crowd. They moved under a string of lanterns that skittered light across the road, and trees leaned in overhead like patient listeners. He told a few plain stories, of a neighbor who taught him rope work, of a winter when he and a stray dog kept each other company, of losses catalogued with few names. He spoke of Clara as someone who had aided with hay in a bad season, and not as a person who held claim to his life. The distinction, when offered, felt deliberate and clear. His tone did not demand Eliza's gratitude, nor did it try to bind her to obligations with sentiment. It simply described, and that quiet honesty mattered. They returned to the ranch beneath a sky fretted with stars. The yard smelled of fresh hay and smoke. Caleb set Lily into a small cot and smoothed a blanket over the child with practiced tenderness. He checked doors and tied latches without ceremony, his motions efficient and unobtrusive. The restraint he showed in offering help rather than seizing control felt to Eliza like respect in the shape of action. He left pauses in conversation so she could measure how much to reveal and how much to keep. In the warm hush of the house, she sat by the hearth, feeling the dress pool around her, its green a small defiant color against long seasons of gray. That night she lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to an animal shift in the barn and to the distant sound of water moving through the creek. Public attention had shown her both the generosity and the slipperiness of small towns. Kindness could be immediate and pure, or it could carry strings, stitched into polite smiles. Watching Caleb move through the festival and then return to simple chores reassured her in a way words could not. His actions added to a ledger of small mercies that might with time balance towards something steady. Morning arrived with a quiet invitation, chores, tea, and the ordinary demand of animals. Eliza rose, hands learning rhythms that had gone unused. She shelled beans, fed hens, and braided Lily's hair while sunlight peeled across the floor. Caleb repaired a fence post with methodical care nearby, his presence a steady hum in the background rather than an interruption. Each small task offered proof that days could be measured by simple duties and quiet mercies, and trust might be built not in grand vows, but in the tiny reliability of repeated acts, and patience grew like steady roots.
Caleb rode out before dusk to mend a broken rail in the north pasture and promised he would be back by twilight, his silhouette narrowing against the low ridge until the road seemed to have swallowed him whole. Eliza watched until his shape blurred into the evening and then shut the door with the slow, practiced motions of someone trying to seal absence from a room. The cabin exhaled its habitual sounds, the floorboard that complained underfoot, a shutter that rattled when wind found it, the hollow echo of a kettle cooling on the hearth. And those small noises became a clock she could use while waiting. She fed Lily from a tin cup and cradled the child until sleep steadied the tiny chest, each breath a fragile metronome that steadied a panic that wanted to become an argument with the dark. When the infant's eyelids finally softened, she smoothed the blanket, set a lamp within reach, checked the door latch, and arranged spare oil and water where she could grab them without thinking. The motion of preparing small contingencies felt less like fear and more like a method, a private engineering of safety. Night stretched its quiet across the yard, and the intervals between sounds lengthened until they became their own measure of time. Branches whispered, a distant animal called, and every tiny creak set a new pulse in her ribs. Waiting for a promised return had become a kind of exposure she could not abide for long. So when the hour passed beyond the outline of ratio, she chose motion over stillness. Saddling Daisy in the hush between midnight and dawn, she wrapped Lily close in a shawl and bound the child in a sling that had taught her how to protect a small life through motion. The mare snorted and stamped but stood steady while she strapped and checked, tack with hands practiced in quiet. The lantern she carried bobbed low to avoid sudden glare, painting the road in a narrow lane of amber that kept the night at the margins and offered her a small domain of control. Riding under moon and frost, the fields glimmered like a map of silver, and the creek cut a bright ribbon that guided her steps. The wind smelled like cold leaves and old grasses, and the world felt paradoxically both more dangerous and more honest in its dark. Her thoughts kept to practical tracks, what fences he might have been mending, which posts usually gave trouble, which gullies took the wind, because when fear climbs into the chest, it loosens into 1,000 narratives, and she preferred to steer by tools and routes she knew. At a low bend she saw the shape of a man and a horse caught against a fence, a mare tangled in a splintered post, and a figure bent to work, hands moving in staccato efficiency that suggested exertion rather than malice. She dismounted before her brain had time to fill with speculation, and crossed the mud to find Caleb crouched with dirt on his knees, face pinched and breath quick from hauling and twisting, eyes lifting with a look that first registered the shock of seeing her and then the immediate wordless calculus of relief. "You came," he said, and the question landed between them as though confessing surprise at his own vulnerability. The sound of it warmed the cold around. Pride would have kept her from admitting the choice she had made. But pride begets nothing in the dark, and the child needed comfort rather than posturing. So she answered honestly that she could not sit counting minutes while someone she trusted was absent. He did not scold for the risk. He moved to help without drama, passing tools, checking the saddle, calming the mare with a voice that was a flat, steady thing, and a hand that was careful as it brushed grit from her sleeve. They coaxed the animal loose, fed it grain, and set its flanks to relax as the night began to lose a little of its tension. His attention to Lily was unshowy and complete. He checked the child's fingers for cold, warmed a cloth at the lantern, and held it for a moment at the infant's cheek, then wrapped a spare blanket more firmly around the bundle. The gestures were not performances of generosity so much as competent acts that answered need, and in their ordinariness they held a tenderness that had no claim attached. When they led the animals toward the lane to ride home, the sky had a thin light at its edge, the kind that does not promise immediate dawn, but makes the world legible in a way darkness had not allowed. On the ride back the conversation was practical, stitched of work and weather, where a post had rotted enough to invite a break, how the river would run after heavy rain, whether the barn step needed a fresh plank, but their words had a softer undertow after the shared exertion. At the cabin they shed wet outer layers and warmed hands over the stove, the hearth answering with patient heat, while outside the world still held the chill of night. Caleb set a pot to boil, and when steam rose, he poured tea into a chipped cup and extended it to her with a small sound like a half laugh and a brief meeting of fingers. The contact was light as a promise, and neither demanded explanation. They ate a simple supper and spoke little of the fear that had summoned her.
It had been acted through rather than solved by speech, and the sequence of doing and responding had shifted the shape of their relationship. After Lily slept another short while, they sat by the fire trading practical details about mending harness and where the best fence posts were on a slope to take sun, so they would drive faster, and the quiet between sentences became companionable rather than low. She realized, not in a declaration but in the ledger of small acts, that her action had been an assertion of agency. She had moved rather than endured, and he had met that movement with a measured steadiness rather than with possessiveness or praise. Before sleep she arranged essentials: rope, lamp, a sharpened knife in places where they would be handy, and he tightened the latch and set a fresh bundle of wood by the iron. His adjustments read like consent to guard rather than command. Dawn lightened the sky in a slow, patient way, and chores called them to the barn. Fetch water, feed calves, mend a loose rail. The world demanded nothing poetic, only work, and the rhythm of labor settled nerves that had been raw from vigil. As they worked side by side, small touches, a hand passing a tool, a momentary brush of fingers while tying a knot, became proof that something had shifted, a bond forming not by speeches but by repeated acts of care. The night that began with worry had become a hinge, and in the ordinary requirements of morning, they found a quiet permission to breathe and to register that each had acted and responded in a way that might in time make trust not a brittle thing but a living pattern. Have you ever gone out of your way for someone you cared about? Share your story in the comments. Let's celebrate quiet heroism, like Eliza.
Caleb led them down a shaded track, where aspens burned like small fires, and the path narrowed toward a waterfall whose voice grew before it came into sight. Eliza carried Lily secured to her chest, the infant's fingers curling around a curl of ribbon, as if anchoring herself to the world. The air smelled of wet stone and leaf, cool enough to make cheeks bright and hands numb when the wind brushed skin. Light slid through branches and made moving patterns over moss and roots. Each step drew them closer to a pool that flashed silver and threw mist like lace. The approach softened something taut in Eliza's chest. Movement offered a shape to a possibility that staying had never provided. They reached a shallow lip where water dropped in a bright sheet and settled upon stones smoothed by time. Caleb set a pack on a flat rock and produced a loaf, a wedge of cheese and a jar of peaches, as if he habitually carried what comfort required. He crouched and showed Lily how to hold a twig like a fishing rod, looping grass into a mock line that the child patted with delighted clumsiness. The man's face opened in small smiles without display. His attention always returned to practical tenderness rather than to grand gestures. Eliza watched, surprised at how ordinary care could feel like shelter. Caleb moved with the economy of someone used to horses and fences. His hands were efficient and sure, and when he reached to wipe river silt from Lily's cheek, the touch was gentle and unobtrusive. That quiet competence lodged inside Eliza as a new measurement of safety, competence without demand. He spoke about the ridge where deer favored the dusk, and pointed out a granite outcrop where a hawk nested, naming things as if mapping keepable truth. These were not stories designed to charm, but to situate. Eliza found herself cataloging each small fact, letting patience replace suspicion. A breeze scattered leaves across the pool, and the sun made the falls glitter like scattered coins. They spread a blanket on a gentle terrace of stone and shared the peaches, the juice sticky on tiny fingers, and on Eliza's lip where she tasted sweetness that had not been routine in season. Lily's laughter braided through the air and cleared a room of memory where silence used to mean threat. The sound offered a new frequency for Eliza to learn. She ate slowly, tasting fruit and the odd, sharp pleasure of a moment not shadowed by the fear that had governed her day. They sat close as afternoon softened, conversation moving in practical circles where fences needed urgent mending, which trees produced the best apples, which creek bends offered shade. Caleb's talk returned repeatedly to work and repair, to things fixed by steadiness. He offered no vows about future promises, but described seasonal tasks as if making an itinerary of safety. Stack hay before snow, check pipe, frost points. Train the child in simple chores so she understood motion as mastery. The clarity of tasks comforted Eliza because it translated amorphous fear into discrete acts that could be executed and accounted for. Eliza admitted to herself that widowhood had taught her caution in ways courage could not erase. John's absence remained a weight, sometimes a familiar warmth, and sometimes a choking burden, and thinking of staying beyond winter required opening wounds and reshaping them. She worried how neighbors might narrate a woman newly aligned with a rancher, whether gossip would try to simplify their lives into neat stories. Yet when she pictured mornings smelling of coffee and apples, when she imagined Lily chasing hens and learning names for tools, the images came without drama and felt like possible scaffolds rather than fanciful escape. At a quiet moment, Caleb reached for her hand with a motion that was steady and unembellished. His fingers closed around hers with a pressure that felt neither eager nor assuming. It was the contact of two people aligning work and care. "There is room," he said simply, "if you want to stay." The offer arrived as an opening rather than a demand. She felt relief and apprehension both rise at once. The choice seemed heavy but shaped by small realities rather than theatrical declaration. She answered not with immediate resolution but with inventory. Mornings of chores, a list of repairs, the matter-of-fact training Lily would need to move safely through day. He did not press for answers beyond what she offered. Instead, he described how winter stacked hay which fence rails took priority, and how a child might learn rhythm through feeding and simple labor. His language dissolved abstract fear into precise tasks, turning possibility into a plan measured in hours and lists. That practical clarity suited Eliza because it allowed her to imagine a life arranged by effort and routine, rather than by volatile events. She pictured afternoons of mending and evenings folded into shared tasks, each small success a stitch in a larger cloth. They rose and wandered along the pool's edge while light thinned, gathering stray wildflowers and smoothing pebbles into pockets to take home. The mare waited where they had left her, patient as a creature accustomed to familiar rounds, and their path back felt less like retreat and more like a transfer into habit. Conversation shifted toward gentle reconciliations, how old hurts were eased by small rituals, braiding hair, repairing a sleeve, tending a seedling, rather than by grand proclamations. Trust, they both seemed to agree without words, would be built by repeated competence and quiet regard. Under a canopy threaded by dusk, they returned with pockets full of simple tokens, rounded stones, a sliver of river glass, compressed petals, and Lily slept heavy and warm against Eliza's breast. Lamplight began to glow at the ranch windows, and the smell of cooking floated outward like an invitation. Caleb led them inside, set a kettle on, and moved about with the habitual care of someone who expected to be needed but not to own. He smoothed Lily's blanket and tucked the child into a small cot with the unshowy competence of routine. Care became ordinary there, which felt miraculous to Eliza. Before sleep they sat by the stove and stitched plans into place. Repair a fence before spring, plant a small patch of beans, graft an apple branch for hardier fruit. Practicalities knitted days into patterns, and inside the quiet between sentences lay things unsaid, memories kept, fears held, and a soft growing willingness to risk belonging. Eliza felt a hope measured not by vows, but by nightly return and the ledger of kindness measured in routine. That night she tallied modest truths. Steady hands healed practical hurts, gentle presence could teach trust anew, and small repeated acts might grow into a life where Lily learned safety and laughter. Such fragile reckonings felt like the start of something true. Winter descended on the highlands with the blunt certainty of weather that keeps promises. Snow came first, as a hush, and then layered the ranch in a slow, relentless whiteness that folded fence posts and orchard rows into anonymous mounds. Eliza learned the language of cold, how to bank a stove so embers kept a house alive through the night, how to thaw water without inviting swell in painful joints, which boots held warmth longest and which seams required mending before frost could pry them open. Days measured themselves in chores made precise by necessity, stacking wood, checking harnesses, ladling stew, and within that measured life, small rhythms formed a scaffold sturdy enough to hold a fragile piece. Storms came heavy enough to erase tracks by noon, and on one such night, wind sharpened into teeth and the cabin's thin panes shook with a keening that matched the memory of other nights Eliza had hoped never to relive. Lily slept in a small cot near the hearth, bundled beneath a quilt that smelled of flower and cedar. Outside, pines bowed under weight, and the creek's voice was muffled by ice. They sat close with a single lamp and the fire's slow pulse, leaning into a domestic closeness carved by necessity rather than ceremony. The storm's howl made the room feel smaller and more precious, and in that compressed air words turned spare and true. Caleb cleared a space on a low stool and reached into a pocket, producing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled the cloth with hands steady from years of work, and set a narrow band of silver into Eliza's palm. Plain on first glance, softened by wear, its face faintly engraved with a mother's initial and a tiny floral motif. The metal held the dim gleam of winters past. It looked like something kept beside a pillow and passed in seasons when weather and want asked difficult questions. He did not offer the ring as a dramatic flourish, but as a modest instrument aligned with the life he had built, an object that asked for practical consideration rather than for an instant's dazzled assent. His confession was contained and honest. He told her that care had arrived as a posture of doing rather than as a sudden speech, stacking wood before storms, tending a fevered child through the night, repairing a gate before frost broke its post. Love, he said, was not a lightning strike but a ledger of acts, bread put within reach, a blanket smoothed, a fence mended at dawn. He had kept the ring until he could be certain he could offer more than a promise. Certainty, he said, came in the sequence of mornings they had shared and the quiet that had replaced constant alarm. Eliza did not answer hastily. Widowhood had taught her a ledger of caution. She counted the changes that softened her mornings of steady chores, evenings warmed by a hearth that held no sudden terror, a child who slept and woke without flinching, and measured how life might be reshaped without ignoring the past. She considered the social calculus of a small town, how neighbors might tell their story with tidy edges, and she attended to practicalities, carving space to add a room for Lily, ordering timber for a stronger hearthstone, making lists of lessons to teach a child about chores that keep a household safe. They planned a modest spring wedding because small measures suited the life they had begun to shape. A brief ceremony in the yard, neighbors who had lent aid at harvest, a simple communal meal and no pretense. Offers of help arrived without fanfare, timber from a neighbor's stand, a team to haul posts, an afternoon of hands to raise a frame. Mrs. Hannah Tate brought jars and recipes for preserves that would keep through cold months. Sheriff Ben Larson volunteered to haul rails and lend muscle where sore backs could be spared by more hands. Even Clara, who had once glanced with a hint of past ties, came forward with measured labor so long-held resentments could be folded into necessary work. Spring came with the patient steadiness of a kept appointment. Buds pushed through thawing dirt. Days lengthened until chores slipped into light, and Lily learned to chase hens without fear and clap when a calf found its legs. Ordinary noises, rooster calls, the thunk of a mallet, laughter that traveled between buildings became markers of safety rather than alarms. Eliza found astonishment in small joys and practiced speaking modest futures aloud, planting a bean patch, grafting an apple limb, teaching Lily to fetch water without shivering. The wedding itself was brief and practical. Neighbors formed a loose ring and vows were given in a language of work and care, to split wood, to mend fences, to soothe child and neighbor through cold nights, to carry water when pipes froze. They promised to show up rather than to perform, and the ring that slid onto Eliza's finger felt like a hinge that opened days into shared duty rather than a proclamation meant to dazzle. In the months that followed, the ranch became a home because scars were acknowledged and small mercies accumulated into habit. The auction that had once felt like an ending,
The desperate sale that stripped certainties read back into memory as a strange pivot that pushed her toward a life where choice, however limited, could be exercised and where kindness translated into tools, shelter and steady hands rather than into new chains. With neighbors' help, they raised a slightly larger cabin, timber hauled and set, nails driven by hands that had learned to work together, a roof that made more room for sleeping and for keeping small things safe. Years softened memory more than they erased it. Ordinary nights found the three of them by the hearth, with hands busy mending or knitting, the light on their faces quiet, proof that survival might be followed by a form of flourishing. The ranch remained a place of weather and stubborn seasons, hay to stack, fences to mend, calves to watch. But it also held a garden that returned each year, a child's voice learning songs, neighbors who arrived with jars and practical advice. Sometimes a shadow tightened Eliza's chest for a breath, but the rhythms of tasks eased those pangs. She learned to name fear when it rose, and to measure responses rather than be swept by riff. Caleb's steadiness never pretended to erase her past. It offered an alternative ledger of care enacted rather than demanded. Small acts, passing a tool, tucking a blanket, checking a latch, assembled into trust, ringed like growth rings in a tree. On mornings when frost rimmed the fence posts and light struck like a promise, Eliza watched Lily race between posts and felt a tenderness that surprised her because joy had arrived by repetition rather than revelation. The auction that had once seemed a cliff now read as a turning point leading to stubborn continuity, a place where scars could be acknowledged, where kindness meant practical help, and where the three of them measured love in steady acts and return. They tended the ranch with steady, patient hands.
Neighbors arrived with gifts and practical smiles. Days fell into routine, feeding hens, mending fences, drawing water, and evenings closed with a kettle steaming on the stove. Eliza stood at the doorway holding Lily and watched neighbors bearing jars of preserves and lengths of cedar for a new room. Loss remained a quiet current, but chores and laughter eased memory. The wedding had been simple and true, held beneath a hastily built frame while quilts made seats for relatives and friends. The auction that had once loomed as an ending became a story of choice and neighborly aid. Hands worked together to raise a wall and drive nails, and the scent of fresh timber felt like a promise. Neighbors shared seeds and time and taught children to tie knots and carry water without spilling. Children clapped at the noise and Lily laughed at the movement of people and hands. Every morning began with simple chores, feeding hens, mending a fence, drawing water, and those chores taught belonging rather than fear. The new room rose quickly with many hands, and the cedar boards settled into place as if the house were breathing easier. People promised to bring timber or help raise a wall and then stayed to measure posts and drive nails. Those promises kept more weight than any spoken vow. Children learned work by imitation and play, and the cabin filled with ordinary noise rather than dread. The town moved like a slow, kind tide. Offers of help came as tools, time and practical counsel rather than rumor or cheap sympathy. The celebration that followed the marriage lacked pomp, but offered usefulness. Bowls and plates, stew ladled by careful hands, bread shared with no pretense. The new room gave Lily a space of her own and left a corner for future children. And that small expansion read in Eliza's mind as a remarkable thing. In the months after the vows, the cabin shifted by degrees from shelter into a home because of repetition and habit. Mornings began with the calls of hens and with the routine that steadied nervous muscles, and evenings closed with a kettle steaming and hands busy with mending. Eliza learned to graft apple limbs, stitch harness straps, and plant seeds in rows that spoke of patience. Caleb moved through the work with steady competence and taught practical rhythms. Splice a rope, set a post so wind will not pry it loose, read weather by cloud and smell. He offered care in the form of acts rather than commands, and that quiet competence became an unexpected kind of promise. Grief did not vanish. Sometimes a shard of memory pricked in quiet hours, and the past sharpened around the edges. On some nights the wind would find a loose shutter, and her body would tense at a sound that had once meant danger. She learned to name those pangs and to share them in small measures with Caleb, who listened without trying to fix the feeling. He offered steadiness and work and let sorrow run its slow course until warmth could be returned to a hardened place. The telling of the auction changed into a narrative of how neighbors gathered to haul timber, lend a mule and share labor. The village described the turning not to minimize grief, but to record how rebuilding happens through many hands. Children grew into the rhythm of chores and laughter, another child learning names for tools, a small hand shown how to tie a loop, voices taught to carry water without spilling. The household filled with the ordinary music of growth rather than with held breath, and the daily tasks became the language of safety. Neighbors remained essential because the frontier demanded shared labor. Sheriff Larson hauled rails when storms threatened roads, and Miss Tate brought bread when hands were sore. Clara's earlier hint of acquaintance smoothed into a simple history of having hauled hay and patched roofs. Complicated pasts were made practical by weather and work. Evenings often ended with many hands around a low table, repairing a roof or splitting wood while small songs rose under lantern light. Those communal rituals redefined danger into task and turned neighbor into shared effort. The barn roof rose with shoulders that had once watched from porches, and then stepped forward. As seasons turned, the family planned humble improvements: a deeper well to draw clearer water, a root cellar lined with stone, a wider porch where quilts might hang to dry, and where children could play safely. Plans were written down and executed according to the weather. Seeds saved for drought, posts set before winter, grafted limbs watched until fruit returned. The frontier did not relent. Droughts came and winters sharpened their teeth, but the family endured because tasks were divided and help arrived when needed. Love in this place took the shape of repeated acts: mending a harness, sharing the last slice of bread, sitting through a long night to tend a fever, and those acts accumulated into a ledger of care. Years softened but did not erase scars. Ordinary nights found the household by the hearth, with hands busy and light on faces that had learned to breathe again. Children learned craft and care, and laughter became the new punctuation of days. Mornings began with the ordinary duty of animals and the simple reward of harvest. The ranch stayed a place of weather and stubborn seasons, but also became a place where neighbors came with jars and advice, where a barn mended under a ring of shoulders, and where songs rose with lantern light. The story moving forward holds more harvests and occasional failures, new neighbors arriving with stories, perhaps a small schoolhouse down the lane where children learn letters alongside chores. Trials will come: a late freeze, an animal lost, a dry summer, but the foundation now rests on routine and reciprocity and the likelihood that those who have given before will answer calls for aid again. Will their love endure the unpredictable cruelty of the front? Its survival depends on the same things that steadied them so far: shared labor, kept promises, and willingness to answer need without pretense. If this chapter touched you, imagine what comes next and share it in the comments. Predict hardships and small triumphs. Name a moment you recall when love gave you courage. And subscribe to follow Eliza, Caleb, and Lily through seasons to come. Tell a story where repeated small acts changed a life and help others find courage in your memory. These lives show that resilience grows from ordinary work and neighborly hands, that hope takes root in steady days, and that new beginnings can rise from even the sharpest losses when practical kindness and quiet resolve gather around a single heart.